I spent the better part of 30 years believing that if you wanted flat, square lumber, you needed a machine to do it. And not a cheap one either. A decent electric joiner runs you $1,000, sometimes more. It weighs 300 pounds. It screams loud enough to rattle your fillings. And if you lose focus for half a second, it can take a finger before you even feel it. I just accepted that as the cost of doing business. Then about 4 years ago, I was at a traditional woodworking gathering in southern Germany, and I watched a man flatten a rough-sawn oak board in under 3 minutes. No electricity, no noise. Just a long wooden plane gliding across the surface, peeling off ribbons of wood so thin you could read a newspaper through them. The board came off that bench flatter than anything my powered joiner has ever produced. I stood there feeling like I had been doing this wrong for decades. Today I am going to walk you through exactly what that tool is, how medieval guild craftsmen used it, and how you can build or buy one for a fraction of what a machine costs. Plus, stick around to the end because I will show you a simple shaving trick that tells you whether your blade is set perfectly without any measuring tools at all. Let me show you what I found. What we are talking about today is the traditional wooden joiner plane, the single most important stock preparation tool in any pre-industrial woodworking shop. This is the tool that turned rough timber into workable lumber for centuries before electricity existed. And once you understand how it works and why it works, you start to realize that the machine version is not an upgrade. It is a compromise. So let me take you back to where this tool comes from and why those old craftsmen trusted it with their livelihoods. In medieval Europe, particularly in the guild workshops of Germany, France, and the Low Countries, the joiner plane was the backbone of every joiner's and cabinet maker's shop. If you were an apprentice entering a guild in the 1400s or 1500s, one of the first skills you learned was how to use this plane. Not the chisel, not the saw, the jointer plane. Because everything else depended on having flat, square stock to work with. These guild craftsmen did not think of stock preparation as a chore you rush through to get to the real woodworking. To them, flattening and squaring a board was the craft. The quality of every joint, every surface, every finished piece started right there at the joiner plane. And they had a practical philosophy behind it that I think we have lost. They believed that the craftsman's hands should be the final authority on whether a surface is true, not a digital readout, not a set of infeed and outfeed tables. Your hands, your eyes, and a good straight edge. When you joint a board by hand, you feel every high spot. You hear the iron bite differently when it hits end grain or a knot, and you develop an understanding of that particular board that no machine can give you. The furniture and architectural joinery that came out of these guild shops has survived 5, 6, 700 years in some cases. Cathedral choir stalls, sacristy cabinets, guild hall tables. All of it started with a man standing at a bench, pushing a long wooden plane across a rough board. That is the tradition we are drawing from today. And I can tell you from personal experience, once you start working this way, it changes how you think about every board that comes into your shop. So let me start by walking you through the tool itself. Because if you have never seen a proper joiner plane, it is nothing like the little number 4 bench plane most of us keep around. A traditional wooden joiner plane is long. We are talking 22 to 26 inches from end to end, sometimes even longer. That length is the whole secret. A short plane follows the hills and valleys of a rough board. A long plane bridges across them and shaves off only the high spots, gradually bringing the entire surface into one flat plane. The body is typically made from European beech, which is dense, hard, close-grained, and naturally slick on the sole. Some were made from white oak or hornbeam, but beech was the standard in most German and French guild shops, and for good reason. It wears evenly, it stays stable, and it develops a beautiful burnished surface on the sole over years of use that actually reduces friction. The iron is a thick slab of carbon steel, usually about 2.5 inches wide, seated in the body at a bed angle of around 45 degrees. It is held in place with a wooden wedge that locks against a crosspin in the throat. No screws, no adjustment mechanisms, no chip breaker in the earliest versions. Just the iron, the wedge, and the body. At the front, most continental European joiner planes have a horn, a curved handle that rises up from the nose of the plane. You grip that horn with your left hand and it gives you tremendous control over downward pressure at the front of the cut. Your right hand pushes from the rear either on a closed toed or simply on the back of the body itself. The whole tool weighs about 8 to 10 pounds, which sounds heavy until you realize that weight is doing the work for you. You are not muscling this plane through the cut. You are guiding it, and gravity and momentum do the rest. Now, before you ever touch this plane to a board, the medieval approach starts with something most of us skip entirely. You read the board first, and I do not mean glancing at it and deciding which end is which. I mean you spend a minute actually studying what that piece of wood is doing. You sight down its length to check for wind, which is twist across the width. You lay a straight edge across various points to see where it cups or bows. And most importantly, you figure out which direction the grain is running so you know which way to push the plane without tearing. Out fibers. The tool those old craftsmen used for checking twist is a pair of winding sticks. These are just 2 straight, parallel sticks, each about 18 to 20 inches long. one with a light-colored edge and one with a dark-colored edge. You set one at each end of the board, step back, and sight across the tops. If the edges are parallel, the board is flat in twist. If one stick appears tilted relative to the other, you know exactly which corner is high and needs to come down first. I made my pair from hard maple and walnut. Took me about 20 minutes, and they are the most useful things in my shop next to a sharp pencil. Guild craftsmen always checked for wind first, because twist is the hardest defect to see with the naked eye, and if you start flattening a twisted board without addressing the twist, you will plane the whole thing into a thin, twisted board. Grain direction matters just as much. You want to plane so the iron is cutting with the grain, slicing under the fibers like petting a cat from head to tail. If you go against the grain, the iron digs in and tears chunks out of the surface. On most boards, you can figure out grain direction by looking at the edge. The grain lines will angle one way, and you plane in the direction they point downward into the board. Once you know the twist situation and the grain direction, you are ready to actually make shavings. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. This is the part that surprised me the most when I watched that German craftsman work. The actual stroke. Because it is not what you think. Most of us, when we pick up a hand plane, we grip it tight and shove it forward with our arms. That works fine for a few passes with a smoother, but with a 24-inch joiner plane on rough lumber, that approach will wear you out in 5 minutes and give you mediocre results. What I watched this man do was completely different. He stood with his feet about shoulder width apart, left foot slightly forward, and he started each stroke by leaning his weight onto his front foot. The plane moved forward not because he was pushing with his arms, but because he was transferring his body weight from his back foot to his front foot, almost like a slow, controlled lunge. His arms were nearly straight. They were just connecting his body to the plane. All the power came from his legs and his core. And here is the critical detail about pressure. At the beginning of the stroke, he pressed down harder. Stroke. With his left hand on the horn, keeping the front of the plane in firm contact with the board while the rear was still hanging off the edge. As the plane moved across the board and the entire sole was in contact, he equalized the pressure between both hands. And at the end of the stroke, he shifted pressure to his right hand on the back, while releasing pressure on the front. This prevents the plane from tipping at either end of the board and rounding over the edges, which is the single most common mistake people make when they try hand jointing for the first time. That pressure transfer, front to even to back, is the whole technique. Once I got that into my body, everything changed. I could take a full-length shaving off a 5-foot board without the plane chattering or digging in, and after about 10 passes, the straight edge showed nothing but light under the middle and full contact at the ends. Flat. Once your face is flat, you need to square an edge, and this is where the joiner plane really earns its keep. On a powered joiner, you rely on a fence that is set to 90 degrees with a square, and then you trust it. If that fence drifts even half a degree, every board you run across it gets a slightly beveled edge, and you will not notice until you are trying to glue up a panel and there are gaps. With the wooden joiner plane, you square an edge by feel, by reference, and by constant checking. Here is how the old joiners did it. You clamp the board in a vise with the edge facing up. You take a pass with the joiner plane, then you set a tri-square against the face you just flattened, and check the edge. You are looking for light between the blade of the square and the wood. If you see light on the left side, you are tilting the plane to the right. So you adjust your grip to apply slightly more pressure on the left side of the sole. One more pass, check again. It usually takes me 3 or 4 passes to dial in a perfectly square edge, and once you develop the feel for it, you can sense through the plane whether you are cutting evenly across the full width of the edge. What I love about this method is that you are never trusting a mechanical fence. You are checking every single pass against a known reference. And you develop a sensitivity in your hands that genuinely makes you a better woodworker at everything else you do. Now, none of this works if the plane itself is not tuned properly, and this is where a lot of people give up on hand joining before they have really given it a fair shot. The iron needs a specific profile. You do not want it dead straight across the edge like a chisel. You want a very gentle camber, a slight curve, so the corners of the iron are set back about 0.02 of an inch from the center. That sounds tiny, and it is. But that camber is what prevents the corners from digging into the wood and leaving track marks on either side of your shaving. When I sharpen my joiner iron, I use a combination of a coarse diamond plate and a hard Arkansas stone, and I apply slightly more pressure on the corners during my final strokes to create that camber. You can check it by holding the iron up to a light source and looking at the reflection on the bevel. The sole of the plane needs to be flat and true, and on a wooden plane, you maintain it by occasionally running the sole across a long piece of sandpaper adhered to a known flat surface like a piece of granite or a cast iron table saw wing. Check it every few months. And the mouth, the gap between the front of the sole opening and the iron, should be tight. About 1/32 of an inch for finish work. A tighter mouth supports the wood fibers right at the point of cut and prevents tear out. You adjust the mouth on a traditional wooden plane by tapping the iron forward with a small hammer until the shaving thickness is right, then locking the wedge firmly. Let me walk you through the full medieval sequence for taking a rough board and making it ready for joinery, because this is where you see how the whole system fits together. A guild craftsman would start with a Riving or pit sawn board, much rougher than anything you will get from a modern sawmill. First, he reads the board, winding sticks, straight edge, grain direction. Then he goes to work on the worst face first with the jointer plane, knocking down the high spots, working diagonally across the grain to remove material quickly, then switching to straight, full-length passes once the surface is close to flat. He checks with the straight edge constantly, maybe every 4 or 5 passes. Once the first face is flat, he flips the board and gauges for thickness, using a marking gauge scribed from the finished face. Then he planes the second face down to the gauge lines. Next, one edge gets squared to the finished face using the method I just described. And finally, the board is gauged for width from that squared edge, and the opposite edge is planed to the line. 4 steps. 1 tool. No electricity, no dust collection, no ear protection, no risk of kickback. And the surfaces that come off this plane are ready for finishing. No sanding needed. That is the system that built the furniture of medieval Europe, and it works just as well on a Saturday morning in your garage. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for the powered joiner by default, even for a single board. Most of us do it because the machine is right there and we assume it is faster. But by the time you power it on, let the cutter head come to speed, put on hearing protection, make 3 or 4 passes, and clean up the machine marks with a sander, you have spent almost as much time as it would take to hand joint the board. For 1 or 2 boards, the hand tool is genuinely competitive. The second pattern is trusting the machine fence without checking. I did this for years. I would set the fence once, check it with a square, and then assume it stayed true for months. It did not. Fences drift, lock handles loosen, and the error is so gradual you do not catch it until you have a stack of boards with slightly beveled edges. Hand jointing forces you to check every edge every time. The third pattern is treating stock preparation as a separate, lesser step. We rush through it to get to the joinery and the shaping, which is where we think the real craft happens. But the medieval tradition treats milling as the foundation of everything. If your stock is not flat and square, nothing else you do will be right, and working by hand gives you an intimacy with the material that machines simply cannot provide. The fourth pattern is assuming hand tools are too slow for real work. They are slower for production runs. Absolutely. But for a home shop woodworker building 1 table or 1 cabinet at a time, the difference is minutes, not hours, and those minutes buy you silence, safety, a finished surface, and a connection to the wood that makes the whole project more enjoyable. Now for the bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I picked up from that same German craftsman, and I have never seen it in any American woodworking book. When you are setting the depth of cut on a joiner plane, instead of using a ruler or peering at the mouth and guessing, take a single pass on scrap wood and look at the shaving. Pick it up. If the iron is set correctly with the right camber, the shaving will be thicker in the center and paper thin at the edges, and it will curl into a slightly cupped ribbon, almost like a tiny trough. If the shaving is the same thickness all the way across, your camber is gone and you need to resharpen. If the shaving is thicker on one side, your iron is skewed in the body and needs to be tapped laterally. And if the shaving crumbles or breaks apart instead of coming off in a continuous ribbon, your iron is either dull or set too deep. That one shaving tells you everything about whether your tool is ready to work. I check it at the start of every session now, and it takes about 5 seconds. It is the kind of quiet, practical knowledge that never makes it into flashy videos, but it saves you from planning an entire board with a poorly set tool and wondering why the surface looks terrible. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what the Lost Workshop is. It is my complete guide to medieval hand tool woodworking, all in one place, with 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, and 156 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time. Take care, and I will talk to you soon.